When you reflect on your career, were there any pivotal moments, and was there a lesson or a principle that you sort of walked away with?
Yeah, I would say probably COVID was probably one of the biggest moments from a career perspective as well as marketing approach perspective. The reality of it was we sort of shifted from this concept, delivering a message that was the message we wanted to deliver versus a message around what people wanted to hear. And there's a big difference when you talk to audiences and you talk to them about what your objectives are versus trying to solve for potentially a pain point that they may be facing or a challenge that they may be facing. You know, I think we also took for granted who our audiences were. We just assumed that they would be there. We just assumed that they would show up. We just assumed that they would listen to what we had to say. Quite honestly, it was now about them. It was a very interesting period of time and really created an amazing shift, quite honestly, I think, in the way that we went about business.
Today I'm speaking with Brian Rowley. He is a former VP of Marketing at Panasonic and Director of Device Marketing at Verizon Wireless. Today, Brian is at BrightSign. They're a global market leader in digital signage, and he is in a CMO role. Brian spoke to me about the fact that marketers have to listen more. I think it's one of those things that all of us in marketing know to do, and yet how often do we actually meet with our customers and clients? And I think we all get stuck in this like day-to-day treadmill of meetings and spreadsheets and presentations and reviews and board meetings, right? And the reality is, if we forget about the fact that we are supposed to look to the outside and lead these brands, if we forget about that, how can we win? And that's exactly what Brian is talking about on today's podcast. So thank you so much. This is Greg Sobiech, and welcome to Narrow Lanes. So Brian, welcome to Narrow Lanes. I'm really excited to have you here with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Now, you are right now at BrightSign.
Okay.
You guys provide digital signage solutions. I think you guys are on the Strip in Las Vegas and in many retail locations. But you were at Panasonic Connect in a VP of Marketing role before this, and at Verizon Wireless. What's been your career journey? How did you get into this role? What had to happen as a lead up to you being in a CMO role at BrightSign?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've had a great career. I've had a lot of great experiences. I've worked for some great people, worked for some great companies. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about what I did want and what I didn't want, right, as I progressed through my career. The thing that I love about BrightSign is I have the abilities to be hands-on. We are a smaller company. We have a little over 100 employees. So it allows me the opportunity to really dig in and actually firsthand be involved in projects versus looking at them from afar and spending my time in conference rooms and boardrooms delivering decks on sort of strategy and approaches. I can actually work to facilitate strategies and approaches. But going back to what you were saying, as you look at it from a career perspective, it was about prioritizing what is really important to me. So is it that I want to be working for that big company where that's all I did was that focus on making sure that the deck is prepared for the next board or whatever meeting, or did I really want to impact to the business? And for me, the choice was to have an impact on business and have a direct impact on it, be able to put my stamp on certain things where I could go back and say that, those were conversations that I was actively a part of and part of the collaboration that took place in order for us to achieve those outcomes.
And look, that totally makes sense. I remember working for Bath and Body Works and 3,000, I think, stores, over 3 billion in revenues. And I was in a director of marketing role. And I really tried my best to create value and to prioritize properly. But I think the impact that I can have at Delve in this role is obviously different than when you work for a large corporation. Now, when you reflect on your career, were there any pivotal moments, one or several, and was there a lesson or a principle that you sort of walked away with?
Yeah, I would say probably COVID was probably one of the biggest moments from a career perspective, as well as marketing approach perspective.
Hmm.
And really, the understanding that I came out of that was we were all fighting for people's time and we had to do it in a different way. And the reality of it was we sort of shifted from this concept of delivering a message that was the message we wanted to deliver versus a message around what people wanted to hear. And there's
Hmm.
a big difference when you talk to audiences and you talk to them about what your objectives are versus trying to solve for potentially a pain point that they may be facing or a challenge that they may be facing. And understanding that we didn't have the luxury of time to be able to decide, okay, well, we want to talk to you about X, Y, or Z,
Hmm.
but we had to make sure that we understood what it was their expectation of a conversation and deliver on that. That was a big moment for us because it shifted the way I look at all conversations we have today. And probably something that was a little bit different in terms of the way that we approached markets from any role that I had prior.
Are you saying that before COVID, this idea of messaging people in a way that was focused on what they wanted to hear about, that this was not as front and forward for you? What
Yeah.
was, why, and why is that?
Well, I think because we realized through COVID that what we were seeing was we only had an opportunity, a very short window of opportunity to prove our point.
Hmm.
And people's time was more important than it ever was because we're all trying to solve these huge challenges.
Hmm.
And we also didn't have the luxury of conversations necessarily like this, right? Because we weren't in front of people. We were trying to have different conversations at different, I'll give you an example. For us, we spent a ton of time in our lives at trade shows and events. Once that was gone, the question became, okay, how do we tell our brand story? Because we used to do that in a trade show environment,
Hmm.
but now we couldn't do that any longer. So what was the way that we were going to do that? So we really had to understand the audiences probably more than we ever did. We didn't have the luxury of like chit chat that you could have, right? That as someone approached you in a booth where you could warm up to a conversation. You had to understand what the needs were and actually get right in there to be able to show the value you had to solve that particular pain point for that individual. So I think the luxury of time really became something that was more of a challenge and really focusing what our conversations were and our messages were.
So, what I'm hearing you say is that COVID, in a strange way, created this vacuum of inputs, like at
Yes.
conferences, and that quietness, that peace, because data was cut off from coming in, forced you and your team to think about other ways to hear what was most important to your customers. And that really resulted in something positive. So it's almost something that was disruptive and sort of dysfunctional, as it may have
Yes.
appeared at first, actually had these unintended consequences.
Absolutely. Because as you looked at it, and as we went through that period of time, I think we also took for granted who our audiences were. We
Hmm.
just assumed that they would be there. We just assumed that they would show up. We just assumed that they would listen to what we had to say. And quite honestly, it was now about them. It was how do we help them progress in the things that they're how do we find new ways to communicate that message? It was a very interesting period of time and really created an amazing shift, quite honestly, I think, in the way that we went about business and do
You know,
today as a result of it.
so I've been doing digital marketing since 1999, and that's been all about really initially my career sitting in front of a computer and pressing buttons, right? And it's
Okay.
spreadsheets and it's presentations. And what I realized over the years is that when a marketer is addicted to data that does fly at us, and there's so much of it, it's actually very easy to forget that we are, in fact, communicating to human beings who look
It is.
like just like us. They're the same
Yeah.
people that we are. But it's easy to, I think, hide behind, again, spreadsheets, presentations, slide decks, meetings when talking about results. And how often do we actually bring into the boardroom or just a conversation an actual perspective about, no, this human being wants value from me and I need to express it this way or it will not land. And no amount of spreadsheets can actually make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, and I think it goes beyond the boardroom, right? So when you start to look at some of the introductions of some of these social media platforms that even exist today,
Mm-hmm.
right? These really well presented, videos or any the media that's really, produced has actually become less important as people want to see things that are more like, I mean, look at how many people are out there shooting video as content on their phones or whatever the
Mm-hmm.
case may be. And it's not this big structured video approach. It's not all of this. It's really being, I think it goes back to just being authentic, right? You can't have an authentic conversation when it sits behind 110, 100 slides, right, in PowerPoint. That conversation gets lost because you're so focused on that data as you represent it, right? But when you start to be a little bit more authentic in it and you start to show who you are, and some of it doesn't require perfection. It just, that imperfection is actually the parts that make it relatable content. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing with conversations. It doesn't have to be so structured. It can just be a one-off conversation that can be incredibly powerful. And I think that's what we're seeing really resonates today, especially in the worlds that we're operating.
Now, when you think about BrightSign, I mean, you guys are a technology company, but you also provide experiences. How does this principle of no, it's important to actually listen to what is value and what's most important to the people that I'm providing this service to?
So it's interesting because BrightSign was founded off of a group of folks that have engineering backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
So very tied up in the whole concept of the technology because it's amazing technology, right? Our BrightSign OS platform is, it's well known in the industry for a lot of different reasons. But I had to shift that conversation because that's important, but only to a certain group of individuals. What we had to look at was what are the experiences that technology can help create to an end user. So understanding exactly what do our customers want and what do their customers want out of an interaction with them as a brand. And then
Mm-hmm.
how does the product play into that in order to be able to achieve that? So rather than going at things at the approach of speeds and feeds and all the great qualities that we have as a product, which we do, and
Mm-hmm.
that's great in certain environments, but that doesn't help us in terms of being able to create the experience, the customer experience that everybody is grabbing for. Because at the end of the day, when you walk into a retail establishment or a corporate establishment or a public spaces, the goal of that is to try to capture you as an audience, right? What do I do to help make that experience even better than it
Mm-hmm.
was a week ago, a year ago, whenever the time frame was? And that's the focus of what we shifted. And that's an understanding of, again, going back to what does that audience want? Not what do we want to show that audience, but what is that audience's expectation of that moment? And how do we help deliver and achieve
And by the
that?
way, we are talking about BrightSign, but I think
Yes.
that this applies to any, whether your time at Verizon, Panasonic, or anywhere else, or my time at Digitas or Bath and Body Works and a bunch of
Yes, sir.
startups in Manhattan. I actually think this is a very universal point, which is why I want to zoom in on this. Give me an example of a situation where, when you came into BrightSign, what did your team tell you in their mind was the value proposition statement to the audience or the customer versus how did you shift it versus what is it now? So
Yeah.
what did they
Yeah.
think was most important versus what have you been evangelizing as really, in fact, being most important today?
Yeah. So, I mean, we very heavily focused, and we still do today, right, on reliability, security, sustainability of our products, all really very important things, right, that
Mm-hmm.
we have in regards to that. But we've just shifted that conversation, right? And established sort of even what our mission is as an organization, right? And that goes to empowering businesses to be able to attract, engage, and captivate audiences by bringing digital signage to life, right? So it's a very different conversation, but without the reliability, securability, sustainability of the product, you can't achieve that. But we don't lead with that. That's not the conversation that I'm out there having. I'm trying to communicate that, yes, we have this great product and those are all really good qualities and characteristics of the product. But the reality of it is the ultimate of what I'm trying to do is attract, engage, and captivate audiences to make that customer experience that much better.
So, this is how it resonates in my business. And this is why I think this is, in fact, a universal point that you're making. So I just came out of a 2-day executive leadership session where, typical thing, you talk about last year, this year, but how we changed the conversation over the last 48 hours is this. We decided to not focus on tasks and instead focus on what is the value that we generate to the client, the brands we serve, and what is the value that we generate for our team from their perspective. So what is the client truly valuing in a relationship with us, and what does the team need? And it's all the idea is to maximize delight with clients and maximize engagement with the team. Now, it's been interesting because that is exactly, I think, about listening to the audience and working backwards from what's most important to them. And to your point, reliability and it's sustainable, so on and so forth. Like in my business, being on time, doing what we said we'll do, being reliable, that's table stake. But why? Yep. What am I working backwards from? And to your earlier point, I do think that's about having a principle and understanding what do they care about, because then the message that I'm sharing with them is one that they kind of want to hear because it's most important to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, it's funny because when I was in prior roles that I had, some of the conversations, we used to get caught up in these conversations and would sit in these meetings for hours on end having this circle conversation that just.
And you mean at Verizon, Panasonic, or other places?
Panasonic, exactly. Yeah. I mean, So I think it is universal, right? But, you would always go back to the one question that said, how does this impact the customer, or does it impact the customer? Because if the answer to that was no, end of meeting, right? There's no need for us to continue this conversation, because at the end of the day, our goal is that customer. That's everybody's focus. It doesn't matter where you are, what business you're in. At the end of the day, you're trying to create the most positive experience for your customers, your customers' customers, and how do you achieve that? That's the focus. That has to be our focus.
So how did that clarity around, I need to understand what the customer cares about, and then I need to be clear that I can deliver on what they need, and then I need to message in a way that resonates with them. How did that, let's call it obsession, that clarity of focus, deliver value at BrightSign? What was an emergent outcome? Was it about, costs, revenue, faster time to close? Did that change something in terms of actually business value that you guys have been able to generate?
Well, I think it helps us in terms of getting back to our very initial point, which was prioritization, right?
Okay.
It allows you to prioritize everything within the business, whether that's from a product development perspective, or that's a partner relationship or partner program relationships that we have, to how we handle ourselves from marketing tasks and events and things that we're doing there. So I think it really does allow us to help prioritize better sort of the things that we're working on within the organization, to make sure that it's solving for the needs that exist versus the ones that we think exist and might not, right? That's really where I think the value and the shift is taken.
Can you share an example of, maybe there was a meeting, maybe you guys were looking at sort of what is on your feature list that you want to launch, and using the lens of what's most important to the customer, you decided to move something to the top of the list, and then something else had to be sacrificed.
Yeah, I mean, so here's what I would say, right? So, we have a lot of different relationships that we have with partners, with our customers, with all of that. And I think one of the things that we've been able to do is understand better some of the trends that are happening and what the industry expectations are, right, of digital signage as an overall, right? So we had to step back and say, okay, these are the areas where we see opportunity in the market, which are there's a ton of them. I could go on. I mean, we've got, we have new emerging applications that are happening in retail and banking, in sports arenas and entertainment, in immersive environments that are popping up everywhere. You see all these museum exhibits, and I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And so, as we started to look through a lot of those, we started to say, okay, what becomes our priorities? Like, what are the strategic initiatives that we as an organization are focused on and challenged with? Because those are the things that help us align. And once we were able to accomplish that, right? And this is basic business 101, right? But it's kind of being realistic about it, right? Because it is business 101, but how many people actually do it and actually implement against it, right? To see success. So what we did was we looked at that and then said, okay, well, yes, it's great that we have this happening over here. We have a customer that's specifically looking for this feature set, but does that solve the need of a larger industry that we're trying to work with? And if not, then we might have to table that. And a part of that is also establishing a level of comfort to be able to say no.
Yeah.
Or not at this time.
Tell me more. Tell me more about that. Like, what do you mean level of comfort to say? Is it uncomfortable to say no? I mean, I think so.
Well, I think so. I think it's uncomfortable for anybody to say no. But the reality of that is, as you are trying to solve for needs in the market, you again have to prioritize what is the most important, and does that align with the strategic initiatives that we have as a business? Because if they don't align with those strategic initiatives in order to get us where we're ultimately trying to get to help move the digital signage industry forward, then you have to say no. And it's okay to, or say no for now, I guess is probably a better way of saying it, because
probably softer.
Sometimes, yeah, because it doesn't necessarily mean no forever. It just means for now that doesn't align with where we are. But it's better than leaving people thinking that something's going to happen that is not going to happen, because it's not possible. So I think there's in that process of prioritizing, I think there's also a level of responsibility to be able to be transparent in that process and be forthcoming, to be able to say, this is where we're at, and these are the reasons why.
So, if I was to take a step back, what I'm hearing you say is that, yes, in fact, to deliver exceptional value, which, again, that can be different things to different people, in the role of a marketing leader, that ability to and willingness to listen to the customer and have messaging and align my whole team to zoom in on speaking to a customer in a way that resonates with them, that focus of limited time and money and resources is about having prioritization. But I almost feel like it's as important to know what to say no to. I almost feel like, if a meeting started with, hey, before we focus on what we want to do, let's talk about what we will not do and why. I wonder how that would change the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think that's part of because the reality of it is, when you look at the breadth of us, we're a global organization, so we have needs coming to us from around the globe, and we just can't, it's impossible for any business, doesn't matter who you are. I've said this for years during my time while I was with Panasonic Connect. It's impossible to be everything to everybody. And as a brand, you have to know who you are and you have to know where your strengths are.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things that you have to be actively promoting and messaging against. But to try to message and be everything to everybody is never going to be a successful plan. It never works. It's just physically impossible. But
Mm-hmm.
if you know who you are and you can promote those strengths and you can capture those in your messaging, in your deployments, in your tactical executions, you will win. That is very clear.
And to add to that, I think what you're saying is that when you know who you are and you know who you are not, it is easier to decide what not to do and
Yes.
what truly be all in on. And we just call it prioritization. But it's really the art of saying no and the obsession with doing fewer things better that you will say yes to.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's all about being relevant, right? Relevant to the conversation, relevant to the needs of the business. You know, nobody wants you to just dabble a little bit in any one area. For me, it is very much a go big or go home type
Mm-hmm.
mentality, right? Like if you're going to dive in and give it 100% or don't bother because nobody has the time for that. And I think you have to be respectful of that. You can't try to be everything. It's just impossible.
And to wrap this point up, is there a tangible example that you could share? And I don't understand who else BrightSign competes with. I assume that there are several players in the market, as there always typically are. But is there something that you guys are really outstanding at because you have that clarity about what's most important to both the customer and the audience that customer serves? And you're
Yeah.
also therefore willing to have the courage to say no to something.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, clearly for the thing that stands us apart from everybody that's in this space is our operating system itself, right? The
Mm-hmm.
reliability of that. And what does that mean from a digital signage perspective, right? The reliability of the OS that we have, BrightSign OS, it's self-healing. It does all of those things. So the player always knows exactly what it's supposed to be doing at all times. And if it's not doing that, it'll resync. So you don't end up seeing like a blue screen as an
Yes.
example, right? So what does that mean to an end user? Well, if you're going into a retail establishment and they're promoting something that's there, having a blue screen isn't going to help them with their business, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing 3D wayfinding or navigation or anything like that you're working with, if people can't interact with a kiosk to be able to do that, then it defeats the whole purpose of that technology being in place. So the reliability for us is one thing that is absolutely the key to who we are and what we've done and why we've been successful all along. Now, that's the power behind digital signage. There's another element to this, which is, okay, well, amazing content is what drives the experience. So we're not a content provider. That's not
Mm-hmm.
what we have. We have plenty of partners that do that. So for us, what we do is we focus on the hardware. We focus on what that's capable of doing. And then we build and have built an ecosystem of partners who can help complement the rest of that in order to be able to achieve the ultimate moment, which is the experience itself.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you decided to go all in on being an expert at the hardware, software side of what you provide, and you made a very clear choice. And I'm sure there were temptations to go in the direction, but you actually decided that you are not in the content business, which would be a natural extension, I assume, for
Sure.
BrightSign to do that. But you guys don't do that because
Right.
you want to do
It's the
something else
hardware
really
and the
well.
software. That's our focus. And then
Mhm.
we work with other partners who actually pull the actual content piece to life.
Understood. Now, if I was to take a step back and if you were to look at your entire career and let's take a proverbial deep breath, had you known what you have uncovered so clearly during COVID, that it's important to listen, that it's important to work backwards from what the customer needs, and it's important to know who you are and who you are not, do you think that your career would have gone in a different direction, or something different would have happened had you had that insight 10, 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, would my career have gone in a different direction? I don't know that it would have. I think what I think it goes back to the amount of hours that were spent trying to solve problems that were problems internally versus what the external world was looking for probably would have been very different. I probably would have saved myself many hours, many agonizing evenings, right, trying to get certain things to be done that didn't really matter, right? So
Yeah.
I think that would have probably, so I think, I think probably not as much professionally as much personally. I think I would have been able to achieve a lot better balance in life had I known that, because I would have looked at things very differently and probably not spent the hours that I would have doing it. But I don't think my career would have changed, because I think as marketers, we're always looking at new ways, right? So there's always, when you look at the digital world, right? When you look at the impacts of social, when you look at the, all the things that we have right now, I don't know that it would have changed my career. Probably would have just changed my perspective in the way I approach certain situations.
I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. Brian, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Brian Rowley is the Chief Marketing Officer of BrightSign, a provider of digital signage solutions. Brian, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to have it.